Hello and welcome. I'm Asima Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Reportedly, President Putin had a call and conversation with North Korean leader after the Alaska summit with US President Donald Trump. This comes amid Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump held a 40-minute call to discuss Ukraine, including the possibility of raising the level of representatives in negotiations. Meanwhile, President Zelensky has thanked White House for trying to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. This comes as Ukraine's foreign minister says Russian overnight attacks show it is critical to end the killing and ensure security guarantees. Hamas has agreed to a new ceasefire proposal in Gaza after 22 months of war with Israel, accepting the terms without amendments, while Israel has announced new plans of shelling of the enclave and dispatching of 1,200 metric tons of aid sent by Cyprus to Gaza enclave. Chinese foreign minister is set to visit Pakistan after he concludes his state visit in India. This comes as India and China are rebuilding ties after the 2020 border clash, with NSA Ajit Doval and Wang Yi holding the 24th round of border talks in New Delhi. Taiwan's foreign ministry declared it must rely on its own defense capabilities for security after US President Donald Trump said Xi Jinping promised not to invade while he was in office. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Xiao Guangwei has stressed Taiwan's commitment to strengthening self-defense. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has stated that the US-South Korea joint military drills are a war provocation, then called for a rapid expansion of his country's nuclear arsenal. The drills launched this week by Seoul and Washington include enhanced responses to heightened North Korean nuclear threats ahead of a South Korea-US summit. Air Canada and the Canadian Union of Public Employees, representing 10,000 flight attendants, resumed talks with mediator William Kaplan after a strike that was declared unlawful by the Canada Industrial Relations Board. Jobs Minister Patty Hajdu vowed to investigate unpaid work allegations as the strike entered its fourth day. The navies of the Philippines, Australia, and Canada have launched a joint sail in the South China Sea amid heightened tensions following a Chinese vessel collision last week. Warships involved included Philippine frigate BRP Jose Rizal, Australian destroyer HMAS Brisbane, and Canadian frigate HMCS Ville de Quebec. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andrii Sybiha has responded to recent overnight Russian attacks on Ukraine and said that a future trilateral meeting involving the leaders of Ukraine, US, and Russia could bring a breakthrough on the path to peace. He expressed gratitude to the US and President Trump for their efforts towards peacemaking. However, he also noted how critical it is to end the attacks, achieve lasting peace, and ensure robust security guarantees. He also confirmed earlier reports that the Russian attacks resulted in damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure and caused injuries to civilians. This comes as the coalition of the willing will meet virtually today to debrief after last night's talks at the White House. Moreover, EU leaders are scheduled to participate in a virtual video conference of the European Council at 1 p.m. Brussels time, according to reports. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Gleb Borukhov. He's an international affairs expert, joins us live from Moscow. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to NewsX World. Now, how do you think, how realistic is it for a trilateral meeting between Ukraine, US, and Russia?
In my view, it is becoming more and more realistic. However, there's still quite a lot of power struggle going on, as you can clearly see with Russia intensifying its attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. I think every side is trying to show to flex its muscle. We can clearly see it with Trump meeting Putin, at the air base, showcasing the latest U.S. jet fighters, and so on and so forth. But it looks like, to me, U.S. and Russia have reached some sort of framework agreement, which now needs to include the consent, some form of a consent from the European leaders. We shall see in the next coming days what shape and form this will take. And I think very interesting also would be to see how much influence does the U.S. under President Trump have over the European leaders.
And now that we are seeing European leaders step up as a coalition for the will of the willing, and does this stance by Europe change anything towards US or Russia?
I think Europe, from what we can see over the last couple of years, Europe has been probably the stumbling block in this peace process. Apparently, there are some economic, geopolitical, or other types of interests at stake. Why Europe is so unwilling to accept, to be more flexible when negotiating with Russia. Because ultimately, if you think about it, Russia. Are you still there?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. If you think about it, Russia has a legitimate interest to protect its borders, from what it is considering a potential threat, which is NATO expansion. So if we'd see something like this happening on the border of the United States, I don't know, Mexico would suddenly become a Chinese ally or something, U.S. would immediately interfere. So from a geopolitical perspective, Russia's position is justified. Obviously, from a humanitarian perspective, no war can be justified, of course. But ultimately, Russia is not really asking for too much, from my understanding. I think the current U.S. administration accepts that and admits that. It looks like they have finally heard the arguments that the Russian counterparts have been putting forward. The major resistance and reluctance remains from the European side. What are the true reasons for that? It's really hard to say, whether it's, some kind of emotional stubbornness, whether there is some serious, economic interest at stake, whether there is, a clash of a geopolitical doctrine. I think it's probably a combination of everything. And to me, it also looks like the European leaders are not really acting as, as independent entities either. Potentially, there is an upper layer, an upper echelon, which dictates what position they should be taking.
And building on that, why do you think you've mentioned Europe's stance and their motive? But what do you think is President Trump's motive? Do you think it's solely winning the Nobel Prize, or there is other motives behind his move?
Again, I think it's a combination. I think there is definitely a personal interest involved. Trump's pride, so to speak, and his desire to form part of history books as a peacemaker. That I think there is definitely part of that. But I think in larger part, there's definitely some kind of economic interests behind this. Maybe I think traditionally, from what I've been seeing over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, Democrats tend to, make money during the wars. Okay, that's why there's been so many wars going on during their governance. Whereas maybe Trump and his allies are looking to make money during the peacetime, because don't forget, there is a lot at stake when rebuilding Ukraine. And these infrastructure rebuilding and regeneration contracts are worth billions and billions. So probably even more than one can earn in selling armaments.
Thank you very much, Gleb Borukov, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has reported that it conducted a strike on an oil refinery supplying fuel to Ukrainian armed forces groups. This comes after Ukraine's energy ministry stated that recent Russian attacks have damaged gas transport infrastructure, and the energy ministry has also confirmed that Russian attacks on energy infrastructure in the Poltava region caused large fires. Now, for this discussion, we go back to Gleb Borukov. He's an international affairs expert, joins us live from Moscow. Thank you, Gleb, for staying with us. Now, do you think, you've also mentioned in your first answer that these strikes continue and maybe they're trying to prove their how strong they are, both countries. Don't you think these continued strikes undermine the current negotiations that are ongoing? What do you think how is it affecting this current negotiation?
I actually think that these strikes are part of the negotiations because, as I mentioned before, each side is flexing its muscles. Okay, so Russia is trying to prove to the Europeans, maybe less to the Americans, but to the Europeans for sure, that it can target and efficiently identify the stockpiles of new armaments coming into the Ukraine. Because Ukraine has been quite good at hiding those flows, how they transport those munitions into the country where they stockpile. So Russia is showing to the West that it's become quite efficient in terms of identifying, targeting, and actually destroying those stockpiles. I think this is what makes the Europeans so nervous, because they are now investing quite a lot of money into replenishing those stockpiles. So every time Russia hits them, that is like hundreds of millions of dollars off the table immediately. In terms of energy infrastructure, I think in modern wars, parties tend to avoid hitting the energy infrastructure normally, because there's quite a big lobby from large energy companies. When such hits occur, then one must assume that, again, this is a show of force, okay? Basically saying, guys, if you don't start, moving in a certain direction, okay, we will use the last resort measure. Again, but if you look at the history of the conflict, these attacks have been relatively mild, because everyone understands that energy infrastructure is very difficult to restore.
Yes.
It's not really an all-out war that we're seeing. It's still a very limited, moderated conflict in a sense.
Yes. Thank you very much, Gleb, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic now. The Kremlin has said that Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump discussed the idea of raising the level of representatives at Ukraine talks in a 40-minute call following the US leaders' meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. This comes after Trump held a meeting in Washington with Zelensky and other European partners. The US president said it was very good and that he had begun arrangements for a meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky after a subsequent call with President Putin. Reportedly, Ushakov in his remarks did not specify what he meant by raising the level at meetings and did not directly address the possibility of a trilateral meeting between the leaders. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Gleb Borkov. Thank you, Gleb, for staying with us. Well, we can only speculate here, but what do you think could this mean, raising the level of representatives? And what do you think was the motive behind raising the level of representatives in the upcoming talks?
Well, if you look at it, let's say from a superficial view, from the view that is presented in the media and that is, becoming available to the public, one can assume that maybe Mr. Trump does not want to, take on the whole responsibility for agreeing a deal with Mr. Putin himself. He wants to share the responsibility. He wants for this, agreement to be like a multilateral, so that all parties who have a vested interest in this conflict, so that they all sign up to this agreement with the view of preventing any future conflicts. So this is what I would say superficial view. A more profound view could be that maybe Trump's administration has finally agreed with the, with the other force, whoever it's represented by, and whoever is basically running the European affairs, to actually finally get involved and sit, jointly at the table. Who these people are, it's difficult to say. So I think it would be interesting to observe who actually attends those meetings. But potentially and hopefully it looks to me that maybe Trump's administration have finally convinced this other power group to actually sit down and negotiate.
And I'm
not talking about Russia. I'm talking about the the power coalition which controls European affairs.
And Gleb, now looking at the broader picture, with Ukraine and Russia both energy infrastructure severely impacted by recent attacks from both sides, how critical is it to include robust security guarantees in any future peace talks? What do you think?
It is very critical to include, peace and security guarantees for both sides, because one thing that we do need to avoid as a humanity is, it's a larger conflict reminiscent of a Third World War, which can involve and will certainly involve, the use of nuclear arms. So this is something that needs to be avoided at all costs. Unfortunately, by the looks of it, the power coalition behind Europe is actually quite willing to do right the opposite. Okay, they are actually looking to prepare potential ground for future conflict. For whatever reasons. I mean, we probably would never understand them. So it is extremely critical for the parties to reach an agreement which guarantees stability of the European continent, for another, 30, 40, 50, 60 years to come, so that we're not faced with another major conflict in the century.
Yes, thank you very much, Gleb, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has suggested Geneva as the possible host for a peace summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky. The summit is expected after both men meet separately with U.S. President Donald Trump. Speaking after high-stakes talks at the White House, Macron has said the meeting would be held in Europe, likely in neutral Switzerland. He noted the last direct talks between Russia and Ukraine took place in Istanbul, Turkey. Macron has added that France and UK will brief allies on the Washington meetings, especially on security guarantees for Ukraine. He stressed any concessions to Russia will be decided solely by Kyiv and warned against legitimizing territorial gains by force. Let's listen into what the French President Emmanuel Macron has said.
Ce sera un pays neutre qui sera et nous-mêmes nous le souhaitons. Et donc peut-être la Suisse, je plaide pour Genève, ou un autre pays, demain, ces réunions. On lance ce travail sur les garanties de sécurité demain. Ce travail est un peu un préalable à tous les rendez-vous. Dans les jours ou peut-être petites semaines qui viennent, on va tout faire pour qu'il y ait cette réunion à deux. Ensuite, l'idée c'est que vraiment d'ici à début septembre, il puisse y avoir ce sommet trilatéral. Mais il y a tout le travail avant qui doit être fait sur les garanties de sécurité. Donc les 15 jours qui viennent sont absolument critiques. Nous, pour finaliser le travail avec les Américains, pour mettre de la substance sur les garanties de sécurité, très important. Mais surtout, on va lever les ambiguïtés. Est-ce que le président Poutine veut vraiment la paix? On le saura. S'il fait cette réunion à 2 puis à 3, c'est qu'il le veut.
Now we go back to our guest discussion with Gleb Borukov. He's an international affairs expert. Thank you, Gleb, for staying with us. Now, given Europe's limited direct involvement in peace process, especially when compared to the US, how effective do you think Macron's suggestion of hosting a summit in Switzerland or in Europe?
Look, from a technical perspective, I'm not sure if Switzerland is actually a neutral country in this conflict. Switzerland has been classified as a hostile country by Russia. So Russia has a list of these countries which are hostile and which are amicable. So Switzerland is on the hostile list. Also, we need not forget that there is an active arrest order by the international courts against President Putin. So, and I'm not sure, but I need to. I'm assuming that Switzerland is part of this agreement. So technically, if Mr. Putin lands somewhere in Europe, including Switzerland, he might be technically arrested. So that is a technicality that needs to be dealt with first and foremost. But ultimately, look, there are other suitable places in the world where such a meeting can take place. I mean, you have the whole GCC region, the Middle East. You have Turkey. United States have demonstrated that it's a safe place for Mr. Putin to go as well. So it doesn't need to be Europe necessarily. I think choosing the place for such a meeting is more of a technicality. I think we need to look into the core essence as to whether such meeting will actually happen. You know, if the parties involved decide to organize such a meeting, they will find a suitable place. But as far as Switzerland is concerned, I think there are those technical limitations which I mentioned.
Thank you very much, Gleb Borukov, for joining us and sharing your insight throughout our news on this topic from Moscow. Thank you very much. Now we move on to our next news. Rebels backed by ISIL have targeted several villages in North Kivu, province of Democratic Republic of Congo, killing at least 52 civilians between August 9th to August 16th. The group is named Allied Democratic Forces that carried out attacks using machetes and hoes while setting the houses on fire in late July. ADF rebels had killed 38 people in an attack on a church in eastern Congo. United Nations peacekeeping mission has condemned the attacks and has warned that the death toll could go up in the coming days. The renewed violence comes as a separate conflict between the DRC and the Rwandan-backed M23 group that continues to simmer in the east of the country despite a series of peace treaties signed in recent months. Both M23 and the DRC army has accused each other of violating ceasefire deals mediated by the US. In response, Congo's army and its ally Uganda have intensified operations against the ADF in recent weeks. Now for this discussion, we're joined by Dr. Charles Sinkala. He's an international relations expert, joins us live from Johannesburg. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. Dr. Charles, what is going on over here from this news? What more can you tell us about the situation?
It's quite disappointing, as you have mentioned in your introduction, that several treaties has been signed. The recent one being in the United States of America, where President Trump also mentioned yesterday in terms of their trilateral and engagement with Ukraine, that he has resolved the war in Ukraine as the sixth war is ever resolved during his presidency. But we've continued to see attacks in the eastern part of DRC and Goma, which war has been there since 1961. It's quite concerning that the elements that they have thought that they are causing the destabilization within the region, which is the M23 linked to Rwanda, is actually not the correct sentiment. The narrative is the Congolese people are fighting against the domination of the escalation, especially private and military security companies who are protecting the interest of the investors who has invested in the mineral-rich region.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charles Sinkala, for sharing that insight from Johannesburg. Now we move on to Bolivia. Bolivians have rejected the leftist movement for socialism, which has ruled most of the past 2 decades in a first-round presidential vote. Centrist Senator Rodrigo Paz led with 32.18%, followed by conservative ex-president Jorge Tito Quiroga with 26.94%. The MAS candidate Eduardo del Castillo managed only 3.16%, according to preliminary results, with more than 92% of ballots counted. With no candidate securing 40% and a 10-point margin, a runoff will be held on October 19th. Outgoing President Luis Arce acknowledged the results, calling them a triumph for democracy. The outcome marks a sharp shift from mass dominance over Evo Morales. The election also reflected deep concerns over Bolivia's fragile economy, with inflation rising to 23% and shortages of fuel and dollars, and null blank ballots reached between 21.5% after Morales urged supporters to reject the process despite isolated incidents. International observers reported no major disruptions. Paz, who has pledged decentralization through a 50-50 economic model, now faces Quiroga, who has promised deep reforms and a break from mass alliances. Both candidates represent a new direction for Bolivia's politics and economy. Let's listen to what Edman Lara, Vice President candidate for Bolivia's second round, had to say.
Nunca en la vida hay que sentirse menos por no tener plata. Hoy se ha demostrado y hemos roto ese paradigma de que la verdad, la actitud le gana a la plata. Bolivia, la juventud, la gente honesta, le ha dicho no al masismo, pero también le ha dicho no a los mismos de siempre. Y ahí está Tito Quiroga, que es parte del pasado, pero quiere aprovechar la oportunidad para volver a robar a la patria.
This is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.